Why can it be so difficult to let go of something when we already know it can no longer continue in the same way? A belief, a relationship, a familiar pattern, a story we have carried about ourselves, an identity through which we have understood who we are and where we belong. I have returned to this question many times because the language around letting go never completely explained my experience of it. And that language has come to me from many places through yoga and meditation, through Buddhist and contemplative teachings, through Stoic philosophy and its attention to what is and isn't within our control, and through teachers and writers I've encountered over the years who have spoken about surrender, acceptance, presence, non attachment, releasing resistance, and loosening our identification with the stories we carry. Many of those teachings have helped me. They have given me the language for things I had experienced but didn't always know how to articulate. And I don't think all of these teachings are saying exactly the same thing, but I do think they point towards something related in our relationship with experience. What I began noticing through my own practice was that letting go didn't always feel like something I could simply do because I had been told it was necessary. We are often given the action: release what no longer serves you, move forward, detach, stop holding on, surrender, accept what is. And there is truth in those instructions. But I began to wonder whether some of what we call letting go is actually what becomes possible when we first meet what is here, when we remain present with an experience long enough to see it more clearly, to notice the state from which we are meeting it, to recognize what has our attention, and to see the beliefs, expectations, identities, fears, or attachments participating in the relationship. And then something might change, something might loosen. We might surrender something we were trying to control. We might accept something we had been resisting. We might recognize that an identity no longer fits. We might see that what we were holding can't continue in exactly the same way. But those things aren't always the action that begins the process. Sometimes they are the consequence of having actually participated in what was asking to be met. That distinction became important to me because what happens when the thing we are being asked to release isn't simply an isolated thought, behavior, person, or experience? What if an entire structure of understanding has formed around it? What if I had learned to recognize myself through it? What if it has shaped how I understand what happened to me, what I expect from others, where I belong, what I believe is possible, or even who I believe myself to be? Then letting go is no longer simply a decision to stop holding. Something has to reorganize. And when that begins to happen, it doesn't always arrive as freedom. Sometimes it can feel like dying, not because the whole of who we are is dying, but because something we have known as ourselves can no longer continue in the same form. Identity organizes experience. It gives us a position from which to meet life. I am this kind of person. This is what happened to me. This is what I believe. This is where I belong. This is who you are to me. An identity influences what we notice, how we interpret what happens, what we expect, what we defend, and where we place our attention. So even when an identity has become limiting, it may still hold together an enormous amount of our experience. A relationship isn't just a relationship, it may contain an imagined future. A belief isn't simply an idea, it's what held us inside a family or community. A story doesn't only explain the past, it also tells us who we are in the present. When something changes deeply enough, we lose more than the thing itself. We may lose the person who believed ourselves to be in relation to it. We might lose the future we thought belonged to us, or the explanation that once made what happened understandable. That is different from simply changing our minds. Something familiar is ending. And I think this is part of what the familiar instruction to let go can sometimes move past too quickly. Before we ask why someone can't release something, it's worth asking what that something has actually been holding together. It's easy to look back at an old pattern and ask why we held on to it for so long. But a pattern often forms for a reason. It serves a purpose. Beliefs may have helped us understand an experience we didn't yet have the capacity to understand differently. An identity may have preserved belonging. A way of responding may have developed within an environment where it served a real function. A story might have helped us continue when meeting everything at once would have been too destabilizing. What now restricts us may once have helped us hold together. That doesn't make the pattern permanently true. And it doesn't mean that because something once helped us, it must continue. But it changes the relationship we can have with it. I don't have to hate the person I once was in order to recognize that something I constructed can no longer carry me. I can say, this helped me continue. This gave experience a structure. This protected something before I had another way of meeting it. And now I can also see what it prevents me from seeing. The last part matters because sometimes the very structure that once allowed us to continue becomes the structure through which we avoid what is here now. What once made continuation possible can eventually become what prevents transformation. There is something else about identity that I think is important here because I don't think the answer is to remove identity altogether. I think identification is necessary. We are human beings. We are moving through a world of form, relationship, time, responsibility, place. We need some way of orienting ourselves within that. Who am I here? Where am I? What relationship am I participating in? What is being asked of me now? What belongs to this particular stage of my life? So I don't think identity itself is the problem. I think the difficulty begins when an identification becomes fixed, when something once helped us locate us becomes the permanent explanation for who we are forever. Because life continues to move, and our bodies themselves show us this. We begin as infants, we become toddlers, children, adolescents, young adults, and then we continue aging and changing. For women, there are other very obvious physiological transitions: puberty, our reproductive years, perimenopause, menopause, and what follows after that. These aren't only words for different periods of life. Something is actually transforming. The body is changing. Our capacities change. Our needs change. Our relationships with time changes. Our responsibilities change. The way we experience ourselves changes. And the way other people relate to us might need to change too. But I don't think we always consciously meet those transitions. We name them: baby, toddler, child, adolescent, adult, mother, daughter, woman, menopausal, empty nester. and then we continue. But what actually happened in the transition? What had to change in that relationship? What had to be let go of? Because the word itself carries much more than the word. I was thinking about this almost like a book. The label is the title of the cover. Let's take the word girl. Girl isn't simply a neutral description. Depending on where you were born, the family you were born into, the culture, religion, geography, social structure, historical period, there is already an entire book of roles and meanings attached to that one word. What a girl is supposed to be, how she should behave, what she should want, what she should not want, what is acceptable, what is dangerous, what makes her good, what makes her difficult, what she is responsible for, what she is allowed to become. So when someone says girl, we might think we are simply identifying something, but we are typically placing an inherited image onto the person. A library already exists around the word, and a child enters into those meanings long before she has any conscious capacity to examine them. Before we can identify ourselves, other people are already identifying us, and they are identifying us through what they have inherited, their beliefs, expectations, and history. The images they were given, their personal conditioning already established. And of course, identification is necessary. A caregiver needs to recognize that an infant has different needs from a toddler. A toddler is developing capacities the infant didn't have. A child begins to participate differently. An adolescent begins separating and developing another relationship with themselves and with the world. So, the identification can help us understand where someone is developmentally. But what interests me is that just because the label changes doesn't mean the relationship has changed with it. The infant becomes the toddler, but as the parent, have I actually recognized that something in our relationship needs to change? Then the toddler becomes the child. The child becomes the adolescent. The adolescent eventually becomes an adult. And all of these are transitions. But if I have never really learned how to meet transition, I keep carrying an earlier image of that person into the relationship I have with them now. A child can become an adolescent while still being related to as the younger child. An adult child can leave home, and a parent can still be relating to them through the role they occupied years before. And we do this with ourselves too. Body changes, life changes, circumstances change, but we continue measuring ourselves through an identity that belonged to an earlier condition of life, most of which has been conditioned and isn't actually what is true or matters to us. I think this is part of what makes transition so important. A transition doesn't just mean that something new has arrived. It also means that something can no longer continue in exactly the same way. And I don't think we're always taught how to recognize that. We are taught the new word. Now you're a teenager. Now you're an adult. Now you're a mother. Now your child has left home. Now you're going through menopause. But where is the recognition of what has ended? What part of the previous relationship no longer applies? What expectation needs to change? What responsibility is no longer ours? What form of dependence has changed? What image of ourselves or of another person do we need to allow to change? because the person or the conditions have changed. And I think we don't consciously meet these transitions. We carry all of them forward, not because the earlier stages disappear. They don't. What we experience shapes us. It becomes part of how we understand ourselves, how we relate, how we respond. And some of that shaping is physical too. It's not only a belief sitting somewhere in the mind as a sentence. So letting go doesn't mean erasing what came before. I don't think we can do that. And I don't think that is the point. There is a difference between carrying what has shaped us and continuing to live as though the conditions that shaped us have never changed. And maybe that is one of the things I have come to understand differently about letting go. It's necessary because life keeps moving. This doesn't mean everything should be disposable or we should detach from everything that matters. But part of letting go is recognizing when something has exhausted its purpose. Otherwise, we can end up trying to meet what is here now through a form that belonged somewhere else. And this is where I have difficulty with some spiritual interpretations of identity, because the answer can become dissolve the identity, let go of the person, become nobody, be the better version of yourself, another concept or belief. But we are still here. We still have a body. We still have relationships, responsibilities, a history. We still need to know something about where we are and how we are participating. And I think another identification can even hide inside the attempt to have no identity at all. Now, I'm the person who is beyond identity. I am awakened. I no longer attach to the human story. But that too can become a position. So for me, the question isn't how do I get rid of identity? It's more, can I recognize the identity I am participating in without requiring that identity to tell me the whole of who or what I am? Can I know where I am without fixing myself here? Can I say that this is who I am here? This is the role I am occupying. This is the history I carry. This is the experience that has shaped me, and still leave enough room for life to change what those things mean, because they will change. And sometimes life has already changed our position before we have recognized that we are no longer standing where we were. That requires letting go, not denying what came before, not pretending it didn't matter or removing the effect it had on us, but recognizing that something can remain part of us without continuing to govern how we meet everything that comes next. And maybe this is one of the things transitions keeps asking us to practice. Can I recognize what this stage of life, this relationship, this role, this belief, this identity made possible? Can I recognize how it shaped me? And can I also recognize when the conditions have changed enough that I can no longer meet the present through the exact same form? There is a concept in the Yoga Sutras that has helped me think about this from another direction. Patanjali describes 5 kleshas, which are afflictions that distort perception and contribute to suffering. The 5th is abhinivesha. It's commonly translated as clinging to life, fear of death, or the deeply established instinct toward continuation and self preservation. Its classical meaning concerns embodied life and biological death. I don't want to collapse that teaching into something it's not saying, but I do recognize something about the movement it describes when I look at what can happen as an established identity confronts the possibility of its own ending. If I'm no longer this, who am I? If I allow this truth to change the relationship, what remains? If I no longer belong here, where will I belong? If the story ends, how do I explain what happened to me? Body might be safe while something within our established organization of self experiences the change as a profound threat. And maybe that helps explain why necessary change can generate such powerful resistance. This is why being stronger or even more aware doesn't mean the resistance disappears, because what we're holding may be entangled with the way we have learned to maintain continuity. The story that protected us can no longer contain what we have seen. The relationship we thought we had is no longer the relationship we can honestly say is here. Something can't remain intact without excluding something that has become true. And that exclusion has a cost too. I also think we need to leave room for grief here. And when I say grief, I don't mean that there is one particular way grief is supposed to look. Grief is complex, it's layered, because what has been lost is different. How we related to what has been lost is different. What that person, relationship, role, belief, identity, or experience meant to us is different. How it has shaped us is different. I think we have an image of grief. It looks like sadness, crying, someone unable to get out of bed, someone dressed in black. In some cultures, there may be wailing or other very visible expressions of mourning. And none of those expressions are wrong. They can be very real expressions of grief, but they are not the whole of grief. The difficulty comes when the image begins telling us what grief is supposed to look like. Then instead of meeting what is actually present, we may begin comparing our experience to the image. Why am I not crying? Why do I feel relief? Why am I angry? Why am I able to continue or not continue with my day? Why did this affect me months later and not when it happened? And I don't think the absence of a particular expression tells us very much by itself, because a loss isn't only the thing that is visibly gone. There can be many relationships contained inside one loss. A job might have been income, but it might also have been routine, belonging, identity, competence, purpose, or a particular future. A relationship might have held an image of ourselves that only existed within that relationship. A belief might have given us an explanation for experiences we didn't know how to understand another way. So when something ends, we may not be meeting one loss. There may be many things inside of it. And I believe this complexity is what gives grief its weight. It doesn't necessarily appear heavy to the outside world, but acknowledging what has changed is significant in our lives. Every attachment we hold carries meaning. There's a reason it has stayed with us. It has shaped who we are. It might have guided us, provided a sense of belonging, or safeguarded something precious. It might have given us a way of understanding who we were and where we were. And this is why the letting go that I am speaking about isn't simply discarding something, it's understanding it, understanding how that experience relates to us and what it has made possible in our lives. That doesn't mean that the experience disappears or that what mattered suddenly stops mattering. And it certainly doesn't mean we can erase its impact on us. I don't think we can, because really, what we experience becomes a part of who we are. There's a significant difference between allowing something to stay a part of our history and requiring it to continue organizing the present in the same way. Maybe grief is how we navigate this, not simply the fact that something is gone, but the relationship we had with it, the place it occupied in our lives, and the weight it carried. And maybe it's about acknowledging what now has to change because it's no longer here in the same form. So, grief doesn't always mean we need to go back, nor does it imply the ending was a mistake. But at the same time, I don't think we should rush toward letting go without fully understanding what we're actually releasing. I think this is where some spiritual language can be misleading. Terms like detach, surrender, let go, and move forward can sound appealing. And again, those teachings can offer supportive guidance. But if we move toward the instruction before meeting the experience, letting go can become another way of not seeing what is actually here. For me, this isn't about cutting something off. It's more about understanding its impact on my life. It's about recognizing how it shaped me, what it made possible or not possible, and whether the way I've been carrying it still fits who I am today. As I wrote this reflection on letting go and why it can feel like dying together, the yoga concept of aparigraha came to mind. It's commonly translated as non grasping, non possession, or non accumulation. Traditionally, it's often discussed in relation to what we acquire, possess, or cling to. But when I bring that principle into lived experience, I find myself wondering about other forms of possession. Can we possess an identity, an explanation, a preferred image of another person? Can we grasp a story about ourselves? Because without it, we wouldn't know what position to occupy. Can we become attached not only to what happened, but to the meaning we have assigned to what happened? This is where aparigraha becomes useful to me as a practice rather than simply a concept, not as a command to discard what becomes uncomfortable, not as indifference, and certainly not as justification for avoiding responsibility or relationship, but as an inquiry into grasping itself. Can I allow my understanding of a relationship to change without denying that it once mattered? Can I release an identity without condemning the person I was? Can I experience grief without immediately interpreting that grief as proof that I must return? And maybe, most difficult, can I remain for some time without immediately constructing something new to take the old identity's place? When an identity has helped orient us, its ending can leave us without the position we were used to standing in. The old understanding may no longer fit. Something has happened, something has become visible, or life itself has changed enough that the way we understood ourselves within it no longer makes sense in quite the same way. But that doesn't mean another understanding immediately appears to replace it. And I think this is part of what can make these transitions so disorienting. We can't return to not knowing what we now know, but we might not yet understand what living with that knowledge is going to require. Who am I here now? Where do I stand? What does this mean? What happens next? This is where I think our hunger for answers can become particularly strong because an answer gives us orientation again. A teacher can give us language. A framework can help us recognize a pattern. A map can show us something we may not have been able to see on our own. And I understand the usefulness of that. But I also began noticing something, particularly within the language surrounding spiritual awakening. There are recognizable experiences that are often described: awakening, the dark night, the void, bliss, surrender, integration. And when we hear those descriptions repeatedly, something interesting can happen. The map that was intended to help us understand an experience can begin teaching us what the experience is supposed to look like. Then the questions change. Instead of asking what is actually happening here, we begin asking, am I in the void? Was that my dark night? Have I awakened? Is this surrender? Why is this not happening in the order I thought it would? The map becomes an image. And now I may be comparing what is actually happening with an image of what I have been told should be happening. I don't think that means the map is wrong. That distinction is important to me. A map is useful. I use maps. Language can help us recognize something. Someone else's experience can help us understand something about our own. But none of those things can replace discernment. Because if I begin trying to make my experience fit the explanation, I may stop paying attention to the experience the explanation was supposed to help me see. And I think something similar can happen with identity. Something ends, and there is discomfort in no longer knowing who we are within it. So we find another position. I was asleep. Now I'm awakened. I was harmed. Now I am healed. I belong to this group. Now I define myself through no longer being one of them. And this is where I think we have to look a little more carefully, because the identity might have changed. The language might have changed. What was the movement underneath it? Was I actually meeting something differently? Or did I need another identity quickly because I couldn't tolerate not knowing where I stood? This is why I think there is something important about the space in between itself. And I don't mean that the space in between is another stage we should now try to remain in. That would create the same problem. I mean that there can be value in not immediately naming what we are becoming, not because we should remain uncertain forever, but because sometimes we need enough time to recognize what has actually changed. What are we still carrying? What are we trying to replace? What are we afraid will happen if we don't have another answer yet? And what is beginning to become visible now that the old identity is no longer organizing everything we see? This changes how I think about readiness too. Maybe readiness doesn't always mean that I know what comes next. Maybe there are moments when readiness is the capacity to remain present after what previously organized me has been interrupted, without immediately reaching for something else, simply so I can recognize myself again. So maybe the question isn't only, why can't I let go? Or why is this so hard? Maybe there are questions underneath it. What am I actually being asked to release? What did this belief, identity, pattern, or relationship once make possible? What would genuinely be lost if I ended in the form I have known it? What am I afraid will happen if I can no longer call this me or mine? And perhaps, most importantly, what truth must I continue excluding in order to preserve it? We don't need to force an ending simply because something has become uncomfortable. Discernment isn't urgency, but neither do we need to keep something alive by continually editing what is true. That might be the place where letting go begins to mean something different, not abandoning or forgetting, not pretending we are unaffected, not rushing toward the next identity because the open space is difficult to tolerate. Because sometimes something really has reached the end of the form in which we knew it. The relationship might still matter. The experience might still be a part of us. What happened might continue to shape us, but that doesn't mean it can continue to occupy the same place or organize our lives in the same way. And maybe the work is not immediately to decide what comes next or who we will become after it. Maybe the work is first to remain close enough to what's actually here to recognize what's ending and what isn't. What am I trying to preserve? What am I having to edit, ignore, or explain away in order to preserve it? And can I allow what mattered to have mattered without requiring it to remain what it was? I think this is part of what letting go asks of us, not to erase what came before, not to discard it as though it had no purpose, but to understand its relationship with us well enough to recognize when that relationship has changed, to see what it made possible, how it shaped us, what we are still carrying from it, and whether the form in which we have been carrying it still belongs to where we are now. Sometimes the ending isn't the disappearance of what happened. It's the ending of the way we have known it. And maybe we don't need to rush past that. We can remain with it long enough to see what is actually here. Slow down, gather yourself, and return to what is true. Thank you for spending your time here with me today. I will see you in the next one.